There are a great number of good movies that capture the history of America. There is definitely plenty for you to watch. But America's history is indeed complex, intricate, and riddled with many myths. But there is one movie that will set the record straight. Let's get on that train. But what does the train have to do with it? It is with its help that Jim Jarmusch demonstrates the natural diversity of America at the beginning of his movie Dead Man. Along with the main character, a clerk from Cleveland, played by Johnny Depp, we traveled from the east to the west of the United States. We can see how the scenery outside the window and the audience on the train changes. The train is a symbol of civilization. Its path seems to repeat the history of America's westward expansion. It all started on the East Coast, where the English established colonies in the early 17th century. The colonization of America by the English was largely inspired by Queen Elizabeth, but not this one, this one. The first colony that was able to withstand was named in her honor, Virginia. The fact is that the Queen did not want to marry, so the English called her the Virgin Queen. Having achieved independence in 1783, the United States received new lands in the West. The borders of the new state now run along the Mississippi River. But the Americans would not stop there. Unbridled desire for progress and development pushes them farther and farther to the West, which is ideologically formulated in 1845 in the motto Manifest Destiny. It suggested that the country's superior institutions and culture constituted a God-given right, even an obligation, to spread American civilization across the continent. In just 70 years since independence, the US would acquire vast territories and spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The public on the train, which we see through the eyes of the lead character, reflects this phenomenon. The farther the hero is from home, the more brutal the people around him become. There is no direct reference in the movie to the year or even the decade in which the events take place, but the director himself said,
"This is in the 1870s, and although the film doesn't tell you that, so it's not so important."
It was an era of great change, especially in the Wild West. The tense silence of the first minutes is interrupted by the train fireman.
"Look out the window." "And doesn't it remind you of when you were in the boat? And then later that night you were lying, looking up at the ceiling."
The mystical appearance and strange phrases create even more tension. The protagonist feels uncomfortable.
"Well, that doesn't explain why you've come all the way out here. All the way out here to hell."
I have a job out in the town of Machine.
We discovered the destination, a metaphor that we will address a bit later.
Machine. That's the end of the line.
Is it?
Yes.
But now it is more important to address the question, why is American history complex? The reason is that it is infused with a context that must be understood. It is this context that Jarmusch addresses in Dead Man. An example would be the end of the dialogue between the protagonist and the train fireman. It is interrupted by gunfire.
"Look, we're shooting buffalo." "Government says killed 1 million of them last year alone."
Why are they shooting? As Colonel Dodge said, every buffalo dead is an Indian gun. Among many Native American tribes, especially the Plains tribes, the buffalo is considered a sacred animal and religious symbol. The buffalo went from numbering an estimated 60 million individuals before the 1870s to becoming nearly extinct in the 1880s. The director again uses allegory, giving the viewer a hint of the narrative that follows. In Dead Man, Jarmusch plays with elements of the Western in an interesting way. The choice is not accidental, as the director himself said.
I mean, there are a few reasons. The Western is It's a kind of allegorical open form. I like that about it. It's kind of a fantasy world that America has used to kind of process its own history through.
The movie has all the elements typical of this genre. As a rule, such films tell about the events of the second half of the 19th century, which take place in the Wild West, away from civilization. But Dead Man is by no means your average Western. What is its uniqueness? When the hero arrives in the town of Machine and walks down the main street, which is a very common trope in the genre, we immediately see that difference. Johnny Depp's character looks nothing like that traveling knight, a fighter against vice, guided by moral values, ready to fight any number of opponents. Bill Blake looks like an absolute outsider, a frightened, intelligent man who has accidentally gotten to a place where he doesn't belong. He is more of an observer whose actions are instigated by the other characters. Therefore, the other elements of the Western, saloon, beautiful lady in trouble, gunfights, pursuit, and so on, look only like decorations that do not carry the symbolic meaning inherent in the genre. The town of Machine itself symbolizes the industrialization carried by the white population, its main advantage over the other inhabitants of America, the exploitation of natural resources, wealth extracted through technology. This is the era of wild capitalism, which is regulated in almost no way by the state. On the contrary, often, in return for royalties, the government willingly leased parts of the federal public lands to companies that hope to extract valuable minerals. The idea is to rapidly develop exploitation of natural resources, so it did tolerate behavior unacceptable farther east. Therefore, the company's owner, Mr. Dickinson, is the actual master of the situation.
Now get out!
A critical look at capitalist greed can be found in many other movies as well.
I have a competition in me. I want no one else to succeed.
What is unique about Jarmusch's view is that greed takes over not only the capitalist himself, but everything around him. Even the intelligent office workers have no compassion for Bill Blake, who is stranded through no fault of his own. In the town of Machine, man is a wolf to man. The protagonist goes to a saloon to drink away his grief. On the way out, he meets a girl whom he walks home. This is where we first hear the main character being asked about tobacco.
Hey, Bill, you got any tobacco anywhere?
No, I don't smoke.
Damn.
This will be an important link, which we will address a little later.
Oh, watch it. It's loaded.
Why do you have this?
Because this is America.
From here, the events unfold rapidly.
Charlie.
Dead Man is an unusual movie that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Some viewers believe that the main character died here and all further events occur in his head. Others believe that the hero is dead from the beginning of the movie and he goes through purgatory. Still others believe that the hero is still alive during the course of the entire movie. But back to the events. Murdered by the protagonist, Charlie turns out to be the son of Mr. Dickinson,
My boy Charlie is dead.
who hires bounty hunters to capture Bill Blake.
You three are supposed to be the finest killers of men and engines in this here half of the world.
Why does he do this? This aspect is important to understanding the history of America and its legal system. When the United States was a young, rapidly expanding nation, law enforcement was often inconsistent or entirely absent, especially in frontier regions. In the 18th century, bounty hunting in America mirrored older European practices. Colonial governments and local sheriffs offered monetary rewards for the capture of criminals, escaped slaves, or even Native American leaders seen as hostile. After the Revolutionary War, as the US formalized its legal systems, the practice became more structured. State and local governments would issue wanted notices offering rewards for fugitives or escaped convicts. As America pushed westward during the 1800s, the US frontier was often beyond the reach of formal law enforcement. Small towns lacked police forces and sheriffs had limited resources. In this context, bounty hunters, private citizens motivated by reward money, played a critical role. 19th century bounty hunters operated in a loosely defined legal space. They had no official badge or training, yet were often welcomed by authorities desperate for help. The Native American is another important character type in the Western, but here too Jarmusch makes an unconventional choice.
Here's White Man's Meadow next to your heart. I tried to cut it out, but it's too deep inside. A knife would cut your heart instead and release the spirit from within.
Nobody is well read and is the most educated character in the entire movie.
Stupid fucking white man.
He helps Blake recover and evade the chase. Usually, indigenous people, by contrast, were portrayed as bloodthirsty savages.
I take many scalps. Seritan oshte. Seritan oshte.
Why is this so? It is due to the history of the relationship between white Americans and native peoples. The Spanish, who had previously colonized the territories to the south, were able to subjugate the native populations fairly easily. The common assumption was that the invaders would easily exploit Native Americans in the English colonies, as Cortés and Pizarro had done in Mexico and Peru, but it wasn't so. Relations quickly began to deteriorate. For example, Virginians grew tobacco, which required more and more land, as tobacco quickly exhausted the soil and intensified the settlers' ambition to acquire Indian land. This led to a clash with the local Powhatan tribe. A fierce assault in 1622 wiped out more than 1/4 of the white population and much of the colony's physical infrastructure. In response, the Virginians conducted annual military expeditions against native villages. The planters, encroached on Indian territories, provoked another war in 1644. Native tribes, Virginians came to believe, were merely obstacles to be removed from the path of English settlement. When the Revolutionary War began, British and American officials urged neutrality on the Native Americans. They, however, were too important militarily for either side to ignore. Most Indians had sound reason for opposing the independence movement. Why? Britain provided them with trade goods, arms, and market for their furs. Moreover, they promised protection against colonial expansion, as the Proclamation Line of 1763 had demonstrated. Yet, at the peace talks that ended the Revolutionary War, the British ignored their Indian allies. They received neither compensation for their losses nor guarantees of their land. Not all the tribes sided with Britain in the Revolutionary War. Indians who fought for American independence, however, reaped little reward. Tribes allied with the victors gained no protection from the accelerating spread of American settlement. George Washington's government then turned its attention to the need for an Indian policy that would prevent continual warfare. Intended in part to promote the assimilation of Native Americans, this approach envisioned peaceful coexistence between white settlers and natives, with the latter living on a portion of the land they currently used and following European cultural, educational, and agricultural practices. With the government's initial conquest theory rendered obsolete by the Indians' refusal to regard themselves as a conquered people, US officials shifted course by recognizing Indian rights to the land they inhabited. Being the prior occupants of the soil possesses the right of the soil, and declaring that all future land transfers would come through treaty agreements. It should not be taken from them unless by their free consent or by the right of conquest in case of just war. The new 3D-based strategy proved effective in the short term. Native American leaders frequently seized land in return for trade goods, annual annuity payments, and assurances that there would be no further demands. A second objective of federal Indian policy was to civilize and Christianize the Native Americans, then assimilate them into white society. However, the efforts to use religion to remake native peoples in a Euro-American mold generally failed. Education was the other tool of assimilation. Federal officials encouraged missionaries to establish schools, but the vast majority of Indian children never attended. They and their parents distrusting the school's alien environment. The problem was that white Americans showed little sympathy for Indian culture. They demanded that Native Americans give up their language, religion, and extended family arrangements. Even the most benevolent whites posed stark alternatives: assimilation or removal. Not all tribes proved so accommodating to white expansion. There were raids across Indiana, Ohio, and western Pennsylvania. In 1794, President Washington, determined to smash the Indian resistance once and for all, sent a federal army, led by the old Revolutionary War General Anthony Wayne, into the area. The army won a decisive victory over 2,000 Indian warriors in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. When did relations between native peoples and white Americans finally sour? The turning point was Jackson's policy of forcible relocation west of the Mississippi. It defined governmental and private practice toward Native Americans for the rest of the century. Appealing at first to sympathy, Jackson argued that because the Indians were surrounded by the whites, they were inevitably doomed to weakness and decay. Humanity and national honor justified removal. Between 1821 and 1840, tribes in the Old Northwest as well as the Southeast were forced westward to Kansas and Oklahoma. Despite resistance from some tribes, most nations were removed. Although both Jackson and the Removal Act of 1830 had promised to protect and forever guarantee the Indian lands in the West, within a generation those promises, like others before and since, would be broken. So we come to the events shown in the movie. During the 1840s, white Americans for the first time came into extensive contact with the powerful Plains tribes, whose culture differed from that of the more familiar eastern woodland peoples. Probably 250,000 Native Americans occupied the Plains. The Plains tribes shared certain characteristics. Most became nomads after the introduction of Spanish horses in the 16th century, increased their seasonal mobility from 50 to 500 miles. Horses allowed Indian men to hunt the buffalo so successfully that tribes came to depend on the beasts for food, clothing, fuel, teepee dwellings, and trading purposes. Here again we can refer to the scene at the beginning of the movie.
Look, we're shooting buffalo. Government says killed 1 million of them last year alone.
With guns, fast horses, and skills in warfare and raiding, the Plains tribes posed a fearsome obstacle to wide expansion. They had signed no treaties with the United States and had few friendly feelings toward whites. White Americans, in turn, sought to restrict the movement of Indians in every way possible and drive them onto reservations. Indigenous people stood in the way of progress as imagined by white Americans, and isolation became the main weapon against them. Let's get back to the storyline. What happened next? The chase.
You are being followed, William Blake.
Another of the main elements of westerns. However, in Dead Man, the chase looks strange, to say the least. The characters move slowly, giving the impression that they are rather traveling. The bounty hunters are more occupied with picking fights with each other.
Fuck you.
Fuck me. Fuck you.
And the protagonist encounters and occasionally gets into a fight with anyone but his pursuers. As is often the case in Jarmusch's films, there is movement. but it's meaningless, a journey without purpose.
Well, which way now? Man, haven't we been here before? Seems like we passed this fork hours.
Oh, man, it all looks the same to me. I really can't tell.
We've been going around in circles, Jack.
The lack of dynamics typical of Westerns allows us to better understand the characters and their experiences, gives us time to think. This brings us to an important motive of the movie, the conflict between the spiritual and the material. Nobody decides to help Bill Blake because he believes in reincarnation.
I'm William Blake.
And you are a dead man.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Is your name really William Blake?
Yes. I really don't understand.
But I understand, William Blake. You were a poet and a painter. And now you are a killer of white men.
Nobody becomes a kind of spiritual guide for Blake and helps him through the natural world. Bill Blake begins as an ordinary man, bound to the rational, bureaucratic and capitalist world. However, in the course of his journey, he in a sense loses his identity.
That weapon will replace your tongue. You will learn to speak through it. And your poetry will now be written with blood.
Gives up his fear of death, acquires a weapon and a mission as a symbol of transformation.
You William Blake?
Yes, I am. Do you know my poetry?
Accepts his mortality as a path to liberation. This is why the hero is constantly asked about tobacco.
Do you have any tobacco?
Have you got any tobacco? You give me some tobacco. I'll trade you some beans for some tobacco.
Do you have any tobacco?
Tobacco was used by Native Americans to give spiritual protection, and it's symbolically asking if he's accepting of this spiritual journey. On the other side, we see characters who try to appear very devout, but in reality are very far from anything spiritual. For example, this strange trio.
Now, why don't you say us a grace out of the good book, would you?
Thank you, Big Jordan. I'd be delighted to do that.
Or the missionary who sells guns and infected blankets.
May you serve the Lord, and may his holy dominion guide you through your dismal life. How can I be of assistance, my poor man? All our ammunition is guaranteed. This latest batch was in fact personally blessed by the Archbishop of Detroit.
Finally, when Blake and Nobody get to the Indian settlement, it's as if we see a mirrored image of the town of Machine. Though it's a different place, different people, but they have one unifying element: death, which is evident in every detail. So what is the movie Dead Man? Jarmusch uses the genre of the Western to show the history of America in all its greatness and tragedy. A country troubled by internal conflicts, a society filled with greed, a place of unrelenting violence. It is a story about an alienated man who can't find a connection with this world, can't get a grip on reality. Everything around him is alien and insane. He strives to be good, but people and circumstances put him on a path he didn't choose. He resigns himself to his fate. It is fascinating that this story doesn't have an ending as such. Blake floats out to sea in a canoe. We don't know exactly what happened to him. This alien who couldn't find a place in a world of machines and money, who made his way through pain, death and loneliness. Want to learn more about American history? Then you definitely need to watch this video.